name is John Orwant. I'm with the Google Cambridge Tea Party Republicans Club. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce our guest today, a man whose fame rises to a level that kind of renders the standard introduction pattern completely obsolete. I could tell you about his 123 books, I counted, the 7 books that have been written about him, the 38 honorary doctoral degrees that he's been granted. I could tell you about the species of bee that has been named after him. Instead, I'm actually going to talk about tenure, because it's actually the thing I think of first when I think about our guest today. We tend to think of tenure today as an entitlement, right? So professors, they work really hard for some amount of time, and then they're kind of granted this lifetime protection from being fired. The institution of tenure has been around for many decades. It really started to solidify around the time of the McCarthy era, where a lot of professors in this country were being asked to take oaths of loyalty as part of the anti-communist fervor that was sweeping the nation. And it wasn't that the university administrations wanted them to take those oaths. They were worried. Like, the universities were worried about pressure from government. They were worried about wealthy donors saying, I'll give you this check for $1 million, but you have to fire that professor over there. And so that's why universities kind of leapt into this institution with gusto. And yet, when you look at professors today, they very rarely take advantage of tenure to speak unpopular views. But of course, our guest today, I think, is the world's best example of doing that. And I think that getting tenure perhaps today should come with a mild obligation to speak truth to power. So anyway, with that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce a man who is to the left of Julian Assange, but with less restrictive, but with fewer travel restrictions, Noam Chomsky.
Well, we're very glad to have you back. You were here in 2008, and now Google's grown considerably, and you have a considerable audience. And as was mentioned earlier, the questions I'm about to pose to you are from Googlers. So you guys went online and you posted questions and you voted on them. All right, so the first one, your early view of the potential abuse of the internet as a political medium seemed to convey a wait-and-see attitude. How has your view evolved, and where do you think the balance of power is headed?
Well, the internet is obviously a tremendous research tool. We use it all the time. I assume by internet you mean more generally the whole kind of IT system that's developed. It's certainly useful for activists and organizers. Almost all activist efforts and enterprises involve intercommunication through the internet. On the other hand, we don't have to talk about the fact that it's a tremendous tool for power systems to control and dominate in all sorts of ways. I, by now, hardly have to mention the NSA revelations, Edward Snowden's revelations. Commercial institutions like Google, for example, use it to undermine privacy and independence in all kinds of ways. So the balance of power is where it always was and expanding. Any technology that's around is going to be used by systems of concentrated power to dominate and control. And you can't open a newspaper now without new things appearing. So take this morning. If you happen to look at this morning's newspaper, there was a report of an Associated Press, some revelations that they've dug out recently about efforts to develop by the U.S. government through USAID, which is supposed to be an aid organization, to carry forward the intensive U.S. efforts to undermine and overthrow the government of Cuba. You read the report, it's interesting for what it says and what it doesn't say. What it says is that the government, through USAID, has tried to set up kind of a social media inside Cuba that could be used to organize crowds to protest with the people not really knowing who they're working for and what they're doing. And the original AP report, most of which didn't get printed, at least in what I saw, says that this has already been used in many other places, the Philippines, Ukraine, and so on, to try to organize anti-government protests, which raises quite a few questions about what's going on around the world. Well, this is one of the techniques that's being used for subversion, domination, and control. This is an Obama program, incidentally, not Bush. And what's said is interesting. What isn't said is interesting. And here, the power of the internet looms in the background. You can quickly find out what isn't said on the internet if you look for it. What isn't said is that this program of course it's not called subversion, it's called bringing democracy and so on, but this program of trying to subvert the Cuban government is part of a long-standing war that the U.S. has been conducting against Cuba. Long-standing. You look at the history of the U.S. and Cuba, it starts in the 1820s. Cuba was regarded by the founding fathers as the next conquest that we have to make. Cuba was waiting there, just we had to take it for ourselves as we expand and become the greatest empire in the world. Well, we couldn't do it in 1823. There was a deterrent, the British. They were too powerful. The British were the main enemy through the most of the 19th century. But the big thinkers like John Quincy Adams, you know, the great grand strategist, he recognized and said that while we can't acquire Cuba now, it will fall into our hands by the laws of political gravitation, just as an apple falls from a tree, meaning in time the U.S. will become more powerful, Britain's power will decline, and we'll be able to take Cuba. And in fact, that's what happened. In 1898, Cuba was liberating itself from Spain, and the U.S. intervened in what's called here liberation of Cuba, but in fact was the prevention of the liberation of Cuba by Cubans. The U.S. took over the island, one of several. Puerto Rico, Hawaii was stolen from its inhabitants the same year, and Cuba became a colony, virtual colony. Well, something quite interesting happened that's highly relevant today. Highly relevant, but never mentioned. But you can find it on the internet if you like. At gunpoint, the U.S. imposed a treaty on Cuba, Platt Amendment it's called, in which Cuba granted the United States control over eastern Cuba. It's what we call Guantanamo. Happens to include Cuba's major port. Its only port oriented towards Europe, which is where its main trade would be. Of course, the Cubans had no voice in this. We just took it over. Actually, there's something, and we've had it for 110 years. Cuba's been trying to get it back, but we refuse. The purpose has no strategic interest for us. It's used for storage of refugees, like if Haitians flee from monstrous dictatorships that we support in Haiti, we're supposed to accept them under international law as refugees, but instead you send them off to Cuba, to Guantanamo, as a storage place. Of course, it's used as a torture chamber. And the Cubans want it back, and we won't give it to them. Does this remind you of something that's happening in world affairs right now? Yeah. Russia took over Crimea, okay? Just as we've taken over eastern Cuba for 110 years at gunpoint. We don't formally annex it, but we dominate it. Russia has a much stronger case than the United States does. Crimea is primarily Russian. Its population overwhelmingly supports Russia. It's got major strategic significance. It's Russia's only warm water port. It's the base for their fleet. It's right on the border of Russia. Russia's surrounded by a hostile military alliance, NATO, and for them it's of great strategic significance. For Cuba, for us, is nothing. Guantanamo, it's just a means of trying to undermine Cuba, prevent Cuban development. And the United States, of course, has been at war with Cuba since 1959, when Cuba finally did liberate itself. Immediately, the U.S. began an attack on Cuba. Under Kennedy, a massive terrorist operation was organized to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. It was Arthur Schlesinger's phrase describing it in his biography of Robert Kennedy, who was in charge of it. It almost destroyed the world. It was a major factor that led to the missile crisis. And it's went on afterwards. The terror based in Florida has gone on almost without a stop. On top of that, there's an economic embargo to strangle the country, opposed by the entire world. Take a look at the votes, annual votes in the General Assembly, which don't get reported here. It's 180 to 2 U.S. and Israel, sometimes Marshall Islands or something. Well, all of this is part of the background to the AP story about today's effort to subvert the government of Cuba. Well, coming back to the internet, what's interesting is what is available and what isn't readily available, because people don't see it. Like, you won't find a word about anything I said in the press or in commentary or discussion, although it's all extremely timely, very timely, you know, not arcane scholarship, but it's right in front of our eyes, but not there. And when you come back to the power of the internet, I think comes back to us. We don't use it. We don't use the resource for the purposes for which it could be used to break through silence, oppression, domination, terror, violence, bring the reality of the world to people. So the internet potentially is a wonderful tool, but only if you decide to use it. If you decide to leave it in the hands of private power, of power systems, whether state or private, sure, it'll be used as a way to oppress and undermine and dominate. But that's a choice. Don't have to.
Well, on that note, we will be posting this on YouTube.
What?
We're going to be posting this talk on YouTube, so your comments will be on the internet. Happy to say.
Internet, but they won't be in the New York Times.
Well, our channel is getting more and more popular, so hopefully people will find this. Switching gears a little bit, what is the most interesting insight the science of linguistics has revealed, but that the public at large seems to not know about or appreciate?
Well, there are a number of kind of dogmas about language, which I think are being systematically refuted, and they're held by linguists too, I should say, not just in the general public, which are probably false, and which I think are being undermined by current research. This is a minority view. I'm not speaking for the profession. The introductory comment said that I'm supposed to be contrarian, so I try to keep to that. But for example, one general assumption about language, almost a dogma in philosophy, common understanding, linguistics, psychology, is that language is primarily a means of communication, and that it evolved as a means of communication. Probably that's totally false. It seems that language is evolved and is designed as a mode of creating and interpreting thought. It's a system of thought, basically. It can be used to communicate. Everything people do can be used to communicate. You communicate by your hairstyle, you know, style of walk, everything. And yes, language can be used to communicate, but it doesn't seem to be part of its design. Its design seems to be radically different, and in fact even seems to undermine communication. If you look carefully at the structure of language, you find case after case right at the core of language design where there are conflicts between what would be efficient for communication and what is efficient for the specific biological design of language. And in every case that's known, communicative efficiency is sacrificed. It just isn't a consideration. And I think that's a conclusion that has very widespread significance. In order to establish it, you have to look at technical work. It's not the kind of thing you can explain in 2 minutes of exposition. But it's not profound. It's not quantum physics. A half an hour would certainly suffice. And I think it's a pretty far-reaching consequence. Another general belief about language, again, almost a dogma in all the relevant fields, philosophy, linguistics, and so on, is that the minimal meaningful elements in language, sort of word-like things, pick out entities in the extramental world. So the word, say, river, picks out the Charles River and so on, something that a physicist could identify. That turns out to be true for animal systems. Animal communication systems, the symbols that appear, the actions that are carried out, do apparently have a one-to-one correlation with mind-independent events. So some particular call of a monkey will be related to leaves fluttering, predators coming, sort of, I'm hungry, some hormonal change. It's just not true of language. Linguistic elements do not have that property. Actually, this was understood by Aristotle. It was understood in the 17th and 18th centuries. There's interesting work on it. The entities that we construct in our discourse, expression, interpretation are largely partially mental objects. There are ways in which they are modes in which we interpret phenomena, but they don't pick out entities in the world that a natural scientist could identify without looking into our minds. That tells us a lot about the nature of language and about our own nature. Language is the core human property. I mean, this was understood by Darwin, by a long tradition before him. And it's very different from the way it's usually conceived. I think those are among the conclusions that have pretty widespread significance. Let me stress again, the very minority view. Very few linguists would agree with this. But I think over time, I suspect it'll become clear.
Okay. In Hopes and Prospects, you mentioned your colleague Kenneth Hale and his work with Native Americans. In your opinion, how important is the problem of language extinction? That is, how important is it for humanity to preserve the current level of linguistic diversity?
Well, Ken Hale was a friend of Ann's as well. The teacher was a fantastic linguist and person also. He worked extensively with indigenous languages all over the world. Australia, he was one of the founders of Australian linguistics, worked with Native American languages, Central American, African, and so on. He did really amazing work, but this particular aspect of his work was something that greatly concerned and interested him, trying to protect, and as he pointed out correctly, when a language disappears, a lot is lost. A language is a repository of cultural wealth. It's a way, this actually relates to what I was saying before, each language is a way of understanding and interpreting the world. It carries the wealth of tradition and history, oral history, which can be extremely rich. I mean, like say, takes the Bible, for example. For 1,000 years, that was oral history before anything was written down. Homer's oral history, and that's all over the world. We're losing those treasures every time a language disappears. And for the people themselves, they're losing their identity. If English disappeared, we would lose our cultural identity. And that's the same is true if it's a small group somewhere. Well, one of Ken's achievements in this regard, which was quite spectacular, was to take the a language which was one of the major languages spoken right here before the colonists came. Remember, the United States is not an ordinary form of imperialism. The United States is a settler colonial society. In fact, that's true of the whole, what's called the Anglosphere, the countries that grew out of the of Britain's imperial domination. United States, Canada, Australia, mostly New Zealand. These are countries where the settlers who came in didn't just run the country the way the British did in India. You know, British in India provided the bureaucrats, the officer corps, and so on. But Indians ran the country under British rule. Settler colonial societies are different, like ours. If you go back to the founders of the country, like, say, George Washington, he understood very well that we have to, as he put it, extirpate the Iroquois. They're in our way. We have to wipe them out. They're an advanced civilization. They, in fact, were the basis for much of the American constitutional system. But we had to extirpate them. They're in our way. Thomas Jefferson said we have to exterminate the native populations because they're attacking us. And why are they attacking us? Well, because we're taking everything away from them. He didn't say that. But in general, the settler colonial societies have to pretty much exterminate the indigenous populations or else marginalize them. Well, that's happened here. So where we're sitting was a place where the indigenous population was close to exterminated, pretty close to it. There are survivors. One of the major languages spoken was Wampanoag. It hadn't been spoken for a century. The last speaker was a century ago. Ken and some students and a woman from the Wampanoag tribe, which still exists, Jessie Littledoe, managed to reconstruct the language using comparative evidence from other languages and missionary texts that were taken and preserved. And from this, they were able to reconstruct what the language must have been. And it now has its first native speaker, Jessie Littledoe's daughter, who's a native speaker of Wampanoag. This has revitalized the tribe. They're now studying it, they're reconstructing their history, they're reviving. It's a pretty amazing achievement. Jessie got her PhD with us, with Ken, in our department. It's the first time this has ever happened, I think, and now there are efforts to do it in other places. But if you can revive, I mean, right now there's enormous destruction going on. Species destruction, for example, is taking place at a level that hasn't happened for 65 million years, literally. The time when an asteroid hit the Earth, apparently, and wiped out the dinosaurs, and the majority of living species were destroyed. Mammals survived. That's why we're around. But right now, the same thing's happening. Species destruction is happening about at that level. And now we're the asteroid, of course. We're destroying the species at a massive rate. Language destruction is kind of a little like that at a cultural and human level. You're destroying the richness of human civilization and understanding of the world. It's disappearing fast. It's disappearing in Europe, not just in indigenous cultures. So if you go to, say, Italy, there are people all over the place who can't talk to their grandmothers. Their grandmothers speak a different language. They're called dialects, but they're actually different languages. The number of languages in Europe has contracted radically over recent years through the policies of state formation. When states are formed, formation of states is an extremely violent process. It imposes a rigid form on societies which bringing together people who have nothing to do with each other and separating people who have everything to do with each other. That's why Europe was the most savage place in the world for centuries while the process of state formation was taking place. You look around the world today and just about every major conflict is based on the imperial borders Borders were imposed by the imperial powers for their own interests, forming states which have no significance for most of the people. So take, say, Pakistan and Afghanistan. We talk about terrorists crossing Pakistan to Afghanistan. They are, many of them are just Pashtun, moving from one part of Pashtun territory to another part of Pashtun territory, which is separated by a line that the British imposed, the Durand Line, which the Afghans have never accepted and the Pashtun have never accepted. That happens everywhere. President Obama, one of his achievements has been to break all records in deporting undocumented immigrants, almost 2 million. They're crossing a border, the Mexico-US border, which, like state borders generally, was established by brutal violence and aggression. The US conquered half of Mexico. President Grant described it as, who fought in it, described the war, described it as the most wicked war in history. Well, okay, that established a border. It was a pretty open border, the same kind of people living on both sides until pretty recently. It's been heavily militarized now, primarily since NAFTA. When NAFTA, the North American Trade Agreement, was instituted, President Clinton, his advisors understood very well that this is going to devastate the Mexican economy, and it's going to destroy Mexican agriculture, it's going to undermine small business and so on. Mexican campesinos can be quite efficient, but they can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness. So there's going to be a flow of immigrants, so we got to militarize the border to prevent them, send them back. Right now, to this day, right here near Boston, right around us, there are people fleeing from the Guatemalan highlands, Mayan Indians, fleeing from the Guatemalan highlands. Their languages are also being destroyed. Why are they fleeing from the Guatemalan highlands? Well, under Ronald Reagan, the U.S. supported a genocidal attack on the highlands and the Mayan Indians by the military dictatorship we were backing in Guatemala. And the devastation was so extreme that they're still fleeing. Well, they're fleeing, we deport them. They're coming across from Mexico, we deport them. That's a state border. That's the way borders work. All over the world, that's the way it works. You take a look at the horror stories all over the world. Almost entirely the result of the imposition of state borders, which also has the consequence of wiping out lots of languages. When you impose a state border that constitutes, say, France, or Italy, or Germany, or Guatemala, or whatever it may be, or the United States for that matter, you're wiping out huge numbers of languages which are internal to them. Well, this is a kind of, it's not species destruction, but it's kind of analogous to us. And it's going on all the time. And the effort to save species, cultures, societies, languages is a major effort happening in Europe too. So right now there's a referendum coming up in Catalonia, another one in Scotland, asking about autonomy or independence. That's dissolving the European state system, something which has been going on for a while, and reconstructing the languages. Actually, I visited Barcelona in the late 70s. You couldn't hear a word of Catalan. It was spoken, but secret, because under the dictatorship, which the U.S. backed, it was barred. 10 years later, if you go to Catalonia, all you hear is Catalan. It revived. The Basque languages revived. Other regional languages are reviving. If you walk around Wales, kids walking out of school are talking Welsh. Things like this are happening. Ken's achievement was unique, but it's a kind of a natural development, I think, should be stimulated myself. But we should recognize that there's enormous loss when the cultural wealth of a society disappears. And that's encapsulated crucially in its language.
All right, so I'm going to change gears a little bit. Again, can you comment on the contribution of research in statistical natural language processing to linguistics? And that's a yes/no question, I realize, but okay.
One of the early proponents of it, maybe the earliest, in 1955, when I was working on linguistic theory, it seemed to me that the only possible way in which let's say a child could identify words in continuous text. You know, you're not hearing single words when you live in the world. You're hearing continuous text. It seemed to me the only way that could be done was by detecting transitional probabilities of sounds or syllables. That, you know, if you get to a word boundary, the predictability of the next sound is lower than if you're inside a word, right? For obvious reasons. So if you check these transitional probabilities, it looked as if you ought to be able to detect words. That's probably the first proposal, maybe the first proposal in the literature. It turns out not to be accurate. Just in the last couple of years, there's been some really careful work on statistical analysis of texts. Charles Yang, who got his PhD at MIT, is now at Penn, a computational linguist, cognitive scientist. He showed that if you actually use this technique on connected text, what you get is syllables, not words. So that doesn't work. He also pointed out that if you add a linguistic principle, you do get a better approximation to words. The linguistic principle is that a word, real words tend to have a stress peak within them, stress pitch peak inside them. So if you add that principle and then you do the statistical analysis, you get a better approximation. There's subsequent work by a number of cognitive scientists which have shown that if you add what are called the prosodic structure, the whole pitch stress structure of a sentence, you know, it goes up and down, really reflecting phrases pretty much. If you look at the pitch structure, if you add all of that, and then you do the statistical analysis, you get an even better approximation. This is one of the very few cases where there's any results from statistical analysis. There's a kind of a industry in computational cognitive science and computer science trying to show that you can get significant knowledge of a language by statistical analysis of texts. Antecedently, that's extremely unlikely to succeed. You do not get discoveries in the sciences by taking huge amounts of data, throwing them into a computer, and doing statistical analysis of them. Try to think it through in the history of the sciences. It just doesn't happen. That's not the way you understand things. You have to have theoretical insights. You have to know what kind of experiments to carry out, what kind of data are worth looking at, which kind you throw away, and so on. That's the way the sciences have always worked. If you want to, say, study the laws of motion, you could take a huge number of videotapes of what's happening outside the window and subject them to statistical analysis, and you could get a pretty good prediction of the next thing that's going to happen outside the window. Actually, a better prediction than what the physics department can give. But it's not science. It's a way of matching data and maybe predicting some new data. But that's not what understanding is. And it's very unlikely to work for language either. And I think the record shows that it really fails totally. I could run through examples. But every example that's been carefully studied, it simply doesn't work for pretty much the reasons that Charles Yang and his successors discovered. You have to understand the principles that determine what underlies the system, and then if you look around the edges of those principles, you can find sometimes useful statistical data. I think that's probably the way it's going to continue, but certainly is the way it has so far.
We're going to change gears again. What, in your opinion, are the most effective strategies for building a more just for building a more just and peaceful world? And in your view, what are the most significant takeaways from Occupy, the Arab Spring, and the Ukrainian Euromaidan uprising?
Well, those are all quite different events, and I don't think you can consolidate them. Over time, there has, history doesn't just go in a straight line. There's progress, there's regression, and they're often in parallel. So say, take the last, say, 50, 60 years in the United States. There's been significant progress in developing a more peaceful and just and equitable society. Probably the most dramatic example is women's rights. Totally different from what it was 50 or 60 years ago. I mean, it may be kind of hard to remember, but if you look at U.S. history, at the time of the American Revolution, the women were not people. They were property. The United States took over British common law, and under British common law, a woman is the property of her father, and it's transferred to her husband. So, for example, one of the arguments against giving women votes was that it would be unfair to unmarried men, because a married man would have 2 votes, since obviously the property votes the way the owner votes. That was U.S. law. If you look at the chipping away of this, it literally was not until 1975 that this principle was abandoned. In 1975, the Supreme Court ruled that women have the right to serve as peers in federal juries. Peer means a person just like you. Okay, that goes back to Magna Carta in the 13th century. Women were accepted as peers legally in 1975. That was part of a major change that's taken place in American culture since the 1960s, one of the main outgrowths of 60s activism. And there are plenty of other things like it. So opposition to, say, violent aggression is far above what it was 50 or 60 years ago. Take, say, Kennedy's invasion of South Vietnam. It's a phrase you've never heard, I suppose, because it isn't in consciousness. It has happened in the world, but it wasn't reported, and it isn't part of American history. In 1962, Kennedy sent the American Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam, authorized chemical warfare to destroy crops, so to drive the people out of the countryside, began big programs to concentrate people in what amounted to concentration camps to prevent them from supporting the guerrilla movement, which was overthrowing the U.S. installed government. That's an invasion. It happened, but not in our consciousness. The reason it's not in our consciousness is there was no opposition. It was reported, it was kind of known, like it wasn't a total secret, but nobody cared. You couldn't get people to talk about it. I mean, literally, I remember trying to give talks in the early 60s in people's living rooms. You couldn't get more people than that together. Well, that was the early 60s. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. It's the first time in the history of the imperial world that there have been massive protests prior to the invasion. Prior to the invasion, huge protests all over the world, here too. My classes were called off because the students wanted to call them off to go down to the demonstration. That was 2003. Well, it didn't end the war, but it limited it. It's often believed that the demonstrations didn't do anything. That's a mistake. The United States could not begin to carry out the policies that Kennedy and Johnson could carry out without a second thought. It was bad enough, but it wasn't B-52 bombing of heavily populated urban centers. It wasn't chemical warfare to destroy crops. Many of the atrocities of the Vietnam War simply couldn't even be contemplated. horrible enough, but not that. Okay, all of that is progress. There's also regression. There's been a big backlash from power centers against the civilizing effect of the 60s. Now, that's the neoliberal attack on the population, which has been going on for a generation. That's why, real wages, for male workers, real wages today are at the level of 1968. For the general public, real wages are about the level of 30 years ago. There's been stagnation or decline for the majority of the population, tremendous concentration of wealth and tiny number of, tiny sector of the population, mostly a fraction of 1%, which feeds politics. Political power reflects economic power. The Supreme Court just yesterday just struck another blow against democracy and its committed effort to try to undermine the functioning of a democratic system by placing power in the hands of those who are super rich. Okay, that's going on. That's the McCutcheon case a couple days ago. Well, that's regression. And they're going on in parallel. That's the way history works. So what's the way to go forward? Well, as Martin Luther King put it, shift the arc of history by your own efforts and activism. That's the only way it's ever worked. The arc of history bends the way we decide to bend it.
In Hopes and Prospects, you compare Obama and Bush too. That's 4 years ago. What would you say today?
Like what I just said about the arc of history, both, better in some ways, worse in others. So for example, I mentioned Guantanamo. Guantanamo was a major torture center. Okay, today probably torture isn't taking place in Guantanamo. At least what we call torture. Remember, the United States has a special definition of torture, which is different from the world's definition. So for example, in the world, a solitary confinement is considered torture. You take a look at the Torture Convention, International Torture Convention. A solitary confinement is regarded, and other forms of mental torture are regarded as torture, and they are. You try to lock yourself up in a room for a couple of days and you'll see what happens. So it's a kind of torture. In the United States, it's surely going on in Guantanamo, but it's also routine. It goes on in the prisons all the time. You go to the maximum security prisons, they are torture chambers. People are confined 23 hours a day in a small room. It drives you insane. So torture, what we call torture isn't going on in Guantanamo. What is torture is going on, but it's going on in the incarceration system generally, and that system is a real international scandal and scale and character. So that's an improvement, not magnificent, but an improvement. On the other hand, there's the surveillance programs, which are, I don't have to talk to you about them, you know all about them. They're mostly Obama. The subversion of Cuba that I mentioned, that's a new Obama program. The worst global terrorism campaign underway right now is Obama's global assassination campaign. Notice that remember what's happened, the drone campaign. Notice that there's a debate in the United States when he decides to murder Americans, like al-Awlaki, is that legitimate or not? And what about the other people? The people who are being murdered are suspects. Go back 800 years again to Magna Carta. We're going to commemorate its 800th anniversary next year, probably mourn its disappearance. The core concept developed in Magna Carta was what we call presumption of innocence. What it stated is that a free man cannot be subjected to state punishment without due process, without trial by a jury of peers. Okay. Now, free man was a very limited concept in the 13th century. Of course, excluded women, excluded people who weren't free, and so on. It gradually expanded over the centuries. So it's embedded in the Constitution also with limits, 14th Amendment, other limits. But now it's being contracted. The drone campaign eliminates presumption of innocence. The way it works is Obama and his advisors get together Tuesday morning and decide who they're going to kill that day. Those people, the concept guilty means Obama decided to murder you. That's the meaning of the concept guilty today. That's a regression that goes back 800 years. That's pretty serious. And what's even more serious is it's not discussed. The only thing that's discussed is killing of Americans. Are Americans different species? You know, who says you can kill other suspects? There's some talk about collateral damage. You know, what about the people who are just standing around and get killed? Well, yeah, that's bad. But what about the people you're aiming at? They are suspects. You haven't proven anything about them. It's just somebody the government wants to kill. Now, that's true of domestic law too. Actually, I'm one of the plaintiffs in a suit that I'm not entirely happy about for this reason. It's a suit about the NDAA brought by Chris Hedges. A couple other people are plaintiffs. The NDAA legislation under Obama, he says he doesn't like it, but he signed it, permits indefinite detention. It extends the principle of indefinite detention for suspects who are, and under this new relatively new legislation under Obama, it is written in such a way that it could include American citizens. It's not explicit. That's what the suit is about. But the concept is it permits indefinite detention of people charged with providing support for enemies of the United States. What's support? No, well, like saying maybe they got a case or something like that. Is that support? It's not a joke, incidentally. The narrow case, the very narrow case, is against one part, the fact that it might apply to American citizens. I think it's way too narrow. It shouldn't apply to anybody. There should never be such a thing as indefinite detention. It's criminal. And the idea of supporting enemies is so meaningless that such a concept shouldn't exist in law. But it's a narrow case about Americans, and that's the framework of discourse here. We shouldn't accept it, I don't think. In fact, take another Obama case, one of Obama's major attacks on civil liberties. It's a case that probably most of you haven't heard about. But I'd look it up if I were you. It's a nice thing about the internet. A Holder v. Humanitarian Law Project, a case brought by the government to the Supreme Court. Government won. Holder is the Attorney General. Humanitarian Law Project was a group that was giving legal advice to a group that's on the U.S. terrorist list. The group happened to be the PKK, Kurdish group. The U.S. government calls it a terrorist group. So it's on the terrorist list. Humanitarian Law Project was giving legal advice to them. Obama's Justice Department decided to condemn that as material assistance to terrorism. Material assistance to terrorism used to mean giving a gun to somebody in Al-Qaeda, you know, but this extends it to giving legal advice to someone on the government's terrorist list. Okay, and if you look at the court discussion colloquy, it could maybe apply to somebody who has an interview with Nasrallah, you know, the head of Hezbollah, as I've had, or just talks to, maybe advises a group to turn to nonviolence. That could be regarded as material assistance under Obama. That's a tremendous attack on freedom of speech and just elementary justice, passed almost without comment. And we might ask ourselves, why should we even take the terrorist list seriously? What's the terrorist list? The executive branch of the government simply determines you're a terrorist. I put you on the list. No review, no judicial review, no defense. It's just an executive act of an authoritarian state. And if you look at the history of the terrorist list, it's mind-boggling. Like Nelson Mandela, for example, was on the terrorist list because the Reagan administration condemned him as his group, the American African National Congress, as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world because they were opposing apartheid, which Reagan supported. Okay? So that's the terrorist list. And Mandela was on it until about 4 years ago, when it took a special act of Congress to get him off the terrorist list. On the other hand, take, say, Saddam Hussein. He was taken off the terrorist list in 1982 because the Reagan administration wanted to provide arms to Iraq. So in order to be legal, he had to be off the terrorist list. Actually, that left a gap in the terrorist list. So they put Cuba in. Why? Because Cuba had been the target of more terrorism than the rest of the world combined in the years before it, mostly based in Florida. That's the terrorist list. So apart from being kind of ludicrous in the way it actually works, the very concept is an abomination. Why should the state have the right to determine unilaterally who's a terrorist? Do they have that right? No, they don't. Do they have the right to murder people who they put on the terrorist list? No, they don't. Do they have the right to charge people with material assistance to terrorism if they give legal aid to somebody that they've designated as a terrorist? I mean, this gets more and more extreme as you go on. These are Obama innovations. Well, history doesn't go in a straight line. I mean, I think myself, Bush would have been worse, but not that there's much to cheer about in this regard.
Some cultures that didn't have a written language until another culture came in that did, and they adopted their writing system. Is there any systematic effect on languages that adopted someone else's writing system?
There is a systematic effect of literacy. It's not so much adopting the writing system as using it for reading. So there's a Ken Hale, same guy we talked about before. He did a very important study in the 1970s in which he showed that it's an article that appeared on what's called cultural gaps. He studied the languages that he worked on, mostly Australian, and found that many of them had all kind of what looked like gaps, like they didn't have number words, or they didn't have color words, or they didn't have relative clauses, and a lot of other things they didn't have. What he showed was that all of this was just totally superficial. The people had all the concepts. They had no problem with dealing with any of them. They used them all the time, but just in more indirect ways. So if they didn't have number words, they would still be able to say, 5 or 10, or had no problem dealing with market societies. They may not have had the color red, but they could say blood-like, And the same was true even of structural things like embedded relative clauses and so on. Well, that was an important study, ignored like most important studies. But shortly after it, somebody else in our department, Wayne O'Neill, another friend of Ann's and mine, who studies history of English, did a study of Middle English. And he investigated, and if he was looking for something similar, he discovered that the use of complex constructions, which had embedded elements in them, increased as literacy increased. Now, there's a natural reason for that. When you speak, you're constrained by short-term memory, right? Which is pretty small. Short-term memory is like around 7 or something like that. The same for humans and other organisms. And that means you can't do much. So ordinary speech tends to be what's called paratactic. You just kind of tack things on one after the other because you can't embed. On the other hand, once you move to literacy, you begin to use capacities that you always had but never used. It's like when people learn, you go to school and you say it's first grade or something, they teach you how to multiply. You begin to use a capacity which you always had. It's not taught. It's part of your intrinsic capacities that you have the capacity for number. Every society has it. Every human being has it. It's kind of it's a mystery that bothered Darwin and Wallace, the founders of evolutionary theory. They asked how could it evolve since it's never used. But it's true that everyone has it. But you can't do it in your head. Like you can't multiply big numbers in your head, right? You collapse after a very short period. But you can multiply them once you learn the technique because you've got the knowledge. You just have to exhibit it. And the same thing happens with literacy. Once literacy spreads, you get much more complex linguistic usage, even in speech, because it carries over from writing to speech. So that effect, I think, is real and documented, but the effect of just using, if you just use the letters to say right things, but you never read, I doubt it would have much of an effect.
I'm curious as to your thoughts, I guess I'm standing now, as to your thoughts on, I guess some people have said that the effect of technology on certain languages has made us dumber. So like texting and LOL or hashtags. And if that's actually true, or if it's just the same as any opinion, it's like new words being added to languages.
I think there's a real question about what might be the cognitive effect. The current kind of teenage technology, it does have a very superficial aspect to it. So that's true, for example, of Facebook. People think they have lots of, I know of cases, teenagers, who think they have lots of friends, hundreds of friends, because if they write, I got an exam tomorrow, they'll get 100 letters saying, I hope you do well, and so on. And the communication is very restricted, simple formulas, things like that. So does it have a dumbing down effect? It has to be, I kind of doubt it, frankly, but it is a topic that could be studied. It is being studied, in fact, but as far as I know, there are no real results, and I think it would be surprising, because it's all kind of superficial. It does add a kind of superficiality to life, which may not be a good thing. I think it's probably harmful in the long run, but to try to, I feel like I'm bringing coals to Newcastle. You people know a lot more about this than I do, I'm sure, because I don't use any of this stuff, except with my grandchildren when I have to.
Is there one last question? We have time for a quick question. There we go.
This fine? So the diversity of languages and cultures is wonderful, but if there's, on the other side, if you would say anything, if you would sort of allow that having, a unified language and common culture helps communication and may advance world peace.
Well, I don't know if it advances peace. In fact, it seems to have the opposite, because you're forcing people into situations of conflict. And the one language that dominates is just the most powerful state in the world. But there's an advantage to having, say, a single language for science. Okay, so by now, English is pretty much the language of science. When I got to MIT 60 years ago, I was teaching scientific French and scientific German. All graduate students in every field had to pass an exam in French and German. It was a complete fake, but that was kind of like a residue of the pre-Second World War period. But it was true, you go back 70 years, a civil engineer had to know French and German. Okay, now it's all gone. No, all around most of the world, the language of science is English. That's helpful. On the other hand, exactly as you say, there's also, if that extended from just some mode of communication to the actual languages of life, it would be a real loss. We would lose cultural wealth. Actually, if you live in the United States and you travel abroad, you see it very quickly. The United States is an extremely insular society. People don't know anything about the outside world. Students in colleges don't know where France is. It's just, they don't know anything. It's remarkably different from Europe and other countries. And part of the reason is that you can go 3,000 miles in the United States and it looks exactly like where you came from. You go to Boston to Los Angeles, the weather's a little different, but everything else is the same. The accent's slightly different. You go 100 miles in Europe and you're in a different society. So you just kind of automatically gain a comprehension of the richness and complexity of life that's missing when societies are homogeneous. Of course, American society isn't literally homogeneous, but comparatively speaking, it is. And I think that's the kind of loss you would get if, in fact, you move towards a universal language. I just don't think there's any possibility of it's happening. As I said, in Europe, there's now actually a reaction against the unifying tendencies of the European Union, more regionalization, regional languages, cultures. It's not just languages, incidentally. So take Catalonia, which I mentioned. Under the Franco dictatorship, Catalonian language and culture were totally suppressed. They could not be exhibited in public. But if you go to Barcelona today, let's say, on Sunday morning, if you're downtown in Barcelona, take a look at the cathedral. There's people swarming towards the cathedral, folk singers, folk dances, Catalan customs being revived. It's a rich culture being revived. I mean, it was kind of there underground. Now it's open. And I think that's just healthy for human life.